Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Okay. Deborah Jump is the co-director of the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, and she has 20 years' experience of working in youth justice as both a practitioner and a manager. Deborah's current research focuses on trauma and youth justice, with a particular interest in the impact of serious youth violence and forensic psychotherapeutic methods. Really glad you could join us today, Deborah. Welcome.
Great, thanks for having me both.
Yeah, hi there, Deborah. Very nice to meet you. Can we begin perhaps by you telling us why you decided to focus on whether boxing was an effective sport for young people at risk of crime, really?
Well, prior to being an academic, I used to work within youth offending services, and I'd mainly work with a lot of young men. And when I asked them when they were being released from prison or they were on probation, what would they be interested in doing as a diversionary activity? A lot of the answers I got were either music or boxing. So for me, because if I was referring young people to a specific activity, I wanted to understand boxing in particular, if it had any influence on desistance from crime, and also why men were so keen to do this as a sport. So back in 2010 now, so over 10 years ago, I did my PhD at the University of Manchester. And it was literally to kind of understand why boxing as a sport was appealing to young men who were kind of embroiled in the criminal justice system, and also whether it had any impact on desistance and their attitudes towards violence.
Right. So what did you think? Why is boxing so popular among young people?
Well, I think particularly amongst young men, because the men are overrepresented in boxing as a sport. I think what it does is that it kind of allows young men to rehearse masculine versions of themselves that help to ward off any victimization. It was interesting because when I did the study, which was an ethnography within the boxing gym, I spent 18 months kind of ensconced within a boxing gym in Greater Manchester. A lot of the young people that were there when I spoke to them had been there because they'd come because they'd experienced violence themselves in some way or another. They'd either been bullied, but they were quite reticent to admit that. But there was kind of history of bullying, there was a history of domestic violence with them as victims, but also some of them had actually experienced kind of gang violence within their local area. So I think what it did is it allowed them to kind of take ownership of violence and kind of rehearse these masculine versions of themselves that somehow allowed them to disavow that sense of victimization. That if you study masculinity, you'll realize that victimization and masculinity do not go hand in hand. So I think that's why it was popular in the first instance. I think also it's kind of twofold boxing. It's appealing, but it also has limitations, as do most things. Is that it does create a community that fosters investment in kind of bodily power and strength, which can be very, very appealing to young men. You know, Connell, who wrote a lot around masculinity, said that sport is the leading definer of masculinity. And I think within boxing, it's the one sport that invests in what the French sociologist Lotwacan calls physical capital. So I think there's that. I think it allows men to invest in bodily physical capital. It allows them to disavow any kind of vulnerability or previous victimization. But I think it also allows young men to commit to differing versions of violence. I think sometimes violence is not a static concept. And I think that there's illegitimate violence, which we would classify as crime or, harming another person. But there's also legitimate violence, which is also harming another person, but within the context of sport. So we think what it does is it allows men to play around with violence in this kind of differing way. Like I said, it's not static, but it also allows them to think about violence and maybe move away from some common ideas of what they think violence is without losing face. So when I spoke to young men who'd been involved in gang violence previously, I said, well, how did you end up boxing? And they said, oh, I left the gang, I came boxing. And when I unearthed what that meant, it meant that they were allowed to leave the gang to go boxing without losing face. I'm not entirely sure they would have been able to leave the gang had they gone on to play table tennis. So, yeah, it allows young men to play with violence.
Right, that's a really interesting way of describing it, Deborah, because when I worked at, it was a forensic unit in East London, we bought a great big punch bag, a sort of man-sized punch bag. But then somebody said, well, actually, there's research which shows that encouraging people to punch things doesn't help them work through their aggressive instincts. It makes them more aggressive. So it was parked in the hall for, well, the whole 6 years I worked there, but that's like many other things, really. Why do you think you're saying that it's a panacea? Why do criminal justice people think it's a panacea?
I think it's seen as a panacea because it's really easy to fill like the local boxing gym with young people on a Friday night who might otherwise be hanging around on the streets involved in gang violence and think you've discovered a magic bullet. And then especially when you see youth crime rates plummet at that particular time, so say between 7 and 9 p.m. on a Friday night, when you might argue that crime and antisocial behaviour is at its peak. So you open the gym, the kids go to the gym and you go, great, we've solved the issue. However, for me, it's more important to think about the identities that are being created and the messages being transmitted within that space. So if we think about desistance theory from crime as a criminologist is pretty much what I'd call myself. There's a really famous desistance scholar called Peggy Giordano, and she concludes that, she shouldn't say boxing in particular, but when she talks about activities, we could argue that boxing is a good hook for change, no pun intended, yet there's no evidence for any cognitive transformation or a replacement self, which she says is imperative for desistance. You need to show that you've changed your cognitive way, your cognitive approach towards that particular element of crime, in this case, violence, or that your identity has been replaced with a different version of yourself. Whereas I actually think that boxing compounds the fact that violence is an acceptable solution to a problem. And I think it reinforces that violence and the potential for violence, which actually is quite important here, is a way to easily accrue respect. So when I spoke to some of the men in the boxing gym in my PhD, but also subsequently, is that one of the participants referred to this idea of respect when I tried to unpack what respect meant. And they said, it's a fear respect. So for me, it's arguable that this messaging reinforces the discourse of youth violence, whereby respect accrued through violence and fear is a really potent masculine currency.
Thank you. That's a very clear explanation. So we were right to park the punching bag in the corridor.
But maybe not so quickly. There are some benefits, which I'm sure we'll show too.
So, Deborah, there has been an all-party parliamentary group on boxing. What did they conclude?
Well, it was myself and Dr. Stephen Hills who wrote the APPG report last year. We were commissioned by the MP who chairs that. And he wanted to explore whether grassroots boxing clubs had any societal effects. So myself and Stephen we didn't do any primary data collection just because it wasn't resourced, but we did do a lot of secondary data analysis. So the report concluded that there is scant evidence for boxing being responsible for any reduction in crime. We may see correlation, like I said, with the Friday nights local boxing gyms, but as we know, correlation doesn't equal causality. And to this day, there hasn't been any large-scale study done on boxing and crime reduction. However, in answer to your parking the punch bag in the hallway, there is some evidence to suggest that boxing can have positive impacts on health and well-being. Some measures suggest that high intensity interval training can reduce anxiety and depression due to its physicality. The 3-minute high intense rounds that come with boxing can have a real positive impact on anxiety and depression, so much so that the NICE guidelines have recommended HIIT training as a way to deal with anxiety and depression. Yet for me, I still feel like that needs further exploration.
Thank you.
Is it an exploitative sport? Because society, as an outsider to boxing, it seems we're quite happy to watch people from marginalised backgrounds do this.
Yeah. And it's funny when I was thinking earlier about what we talk about, a term came into mind that I remember from when I was studying my PhD that says, if you want to know who's at the bottom of society, look who's winning in boxing. And as much as you could say that's quite discriminatory, I think there's truth to it. I think it carries some weight, that statement. And I think what's interesting about boxing as a field of inquiry, whether that's kind of psychological or sports sociology, is that it has everything in there. It has gender. You can look at it from a gendered perspective. It has class. It has sexuality. It has race. It's a fascinating topic to study as a criminologist and a psychologist. In terms of the exploitation and the kind of unintended consequences or the negative impacts from boxing, and if we think about who that impacts, is that the only true evidence of the impact of boxing actually comes from medicine. And as we would expect, the head trauma accrued through the sport of boxing is really damaging and life limiting. And I don't think young people entering the sport really consider this, especially when looking at a career in boxing. They just see the trophies, the respect, the status, the masculine affirmations. And I often say that boxing is a little bit like the military. You don't often see military scouts or boxing clubs in middle class areas. And I think that kind of says it all, really.
Yeah, I think so. We interviewed Dave Harris a couple of years ago, who was trying to fundraise for a specialist care home for older former boxers because it's so hard to find places for them, but also so often they end up with early onset dementia, much, much earlier than the average person in the population would.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And actually another conversation we had, as you know, was with George Capone, who's a woman who teaches women how to box, which made me wonder whether you've ever boxed.
I have. Outside of my PhD, I mean, I boxed within my PhD as it was ethnographic for about a year because I felt it was a way to really get close to the data and to the participants. I originally started as a martial artist, studying Kung Fu and karate for about 15 years. And it was through my PhD research that I actually started to do traditional boxing. I think the one thing about boxing that people don't realize is that they actually think it's just them hitting things. And then you get whacked in the face and you're like, Christ, this is reciprocal violence here. And I think once that happens, it really wakes you up to what it is. There's nothing like a good punch in the face for you to kind of realize exactly what it is that you're doing and participating in. I think if you do non-contact, you don't really get the essence and texture of the combat sport itself. But I think if you do box, you will experience that at some point, and then that's where you make the decision about whether to carry on with it or not.
You don't box now?
I don't box now. I'm sick of being injured. And I think there comes a time when you hang up your gloves. Yeah.
So how did you carry out your research for your PhD?
Well, like I said, I conducted ethnographic research over a period of 1 year. So I was regularly boxing and attending the gym at least 3 times a week. When I first went to the gym, because working in youth offending prior to doing my PhD, I got to speak to some of the kind of mentors who worked in youth offending when mentoring was a big, you would take young men from the community, you'd kind of been through the criminal justice system and try and use that lived experience to kind of help some of the young men coming through the system at that time. And there was a mentor there who was a semi-pro boxer who actually got me access to the gym. Was prior to that, I'd just been in martial arts clubs. So it was him who got me access to the gym and introduced me to the boxing coaches. Because the gym that I boxed in and did my research in, I didn't see a single female in the gym while I was there. So it was just me. I wasn't sure how I was going to research the topic. I thought I would do some interviews, maybe some focus groups. But for at least the first couple of weeks, nobody spoke to me. I just sat on the pads, like sat there with my pen and paper, waiting for people to talk to me. And it was only when a young person came up to me and said, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you boxing?" that I thought the only way I'm really going to get close to this is if I participate firsthand. And having had a martial art background, I had been hit in the face before. Knew how to kind of throw a punch because of the sport that I'd been involved in since being a young person myself, really. So it wasn't that intimidating. And I found that was a great way to kind of get to the core of the issue and experience, the kind of the buzz of boxing and what it kind of means somatically and also psychologically when playing around with that violence that I talked about earlier.
Can you say a bit more about what you found?
Sure. I think so. The benefits, I think that boxing is a great way to foster community. I think it's got great routine and structure. Lotte Wickham, the French sociologist, called it an island of stability and order. And there's merit in that. It can provide access to positive role models and it can increase physical well-being. And there's suggestions that it can reduce anxiety and depression. It's diverse, it's accessible, it's not expensive, it doesn't require a lot of equipment. You can see all the benefits to it. But if we think about some of the kind of more underlying kind of subtext and kind of subconscious or unconscious motivations for participating in boxing, I think the messages and the culture of the gym can suggest that by rehearsing violence, you learn that it's a way to remedy a problem. We are what we repeatedly do. I'm not saying that boxing creates violence, illegitimate violence. I'm saying that there isn't any evidence to suggest that it reduces it. Like I said, psychologically, there's no evidence for cognitive transformation. It doesn't change the way we view violence. And I think what's really interesting is that when you look at the gendered aspect as well, I didn't study women for my PhD, but I have subsequently gone on and wrote some publications about the impact of boxing and gender. And one of the things that I found is that talking about men entering boxing as a way to kind of disavow vulnerability and prevent repeat victimization, it's actually similar for women in the sense that it's used as a mechanism to kind of, overcome vulnerability. However, for young women, it's much more about reclaiming ownership of one's body after sexual violence and exploitation and abuse. So the common denominator here, the thread throughout the appeal of boxing, is that boxing as a sport is used as a way to circumnavigate male violence by both men and women, whether that's domestic violence, gang violence, or sexual violence. So it has all its benefits, like I said, but then I think the unconscious motivations and the reasons why need further research, really.
So, Deborah, you mentioned some differences between men boxers and women boxers. Are there any other differences?
In terms of
Yes, between what kind of things men or women invest in their participation in the sport.
Well, I think ultimately one of the reasons why people enter boxing, not necessarily for it as a career, is for the reasons that I said, which is it's a way of kind of overcoming vulnerability by investing in violent potential. So you don't necessarily have to be violent to accrue respect. You just have to demonstrate that you are capable of enacting violence should the time come that you need to be able to do that, whether that's in defense of the self, on the street, in the home, sexual assault. So I think what boxing does offer is the way of kind of using violence to prevent violence, really. And that's what makes it really interesting for me. Like I said, violence isn't a static concept. It's a resource that is very, very easily drawn upon by anybody, anywhere. And that can be quite a powerful draw, I think, across the genders.
So I like the way you gave a pretty perfect description of how to begin doing an ethnographic research earlier on by sitting in the gym and just seeing how things unfolded. And they did unfold. And I also liked your mention of being punched in the face. And that always reminds me of the remark attributed to Tyson, everyone's got a plan, till they're punched in the face.
Indeed.
Which makes me think this is what the world is facing at the moment, punches to the face.
Indeed. Yeah. And bullying, right?
Bullying, yeah.
Yeah, which is one of the common reasons why a lot of people go in boxing. The amount of times I've been in a boxing gym, and I've been in a lot across the world, where you've seen a mum usually or a dad bring in their son or daughter and say, they need toughening up, they're being bullied at school. And it's just so interesting that parents somehow think, right, the way to deal with this is to get them to toughen up and become violent as a way to kind of prevent this violence.
Certainly heard that quite a lot in the histories of men in prison, that their dads or mums had taken them to the gym to get them to box to protect themselves against bullying. But I suppose also, I think some of the biggest, most muscular guys that you see in prison, you know that before you even talk to them, that they were scared of their dads. There's a lot of violence in the family home, and actually there seems to be something about trying to kit themselves up to be able to deal with any sort of physical fear that they might experience going forward.
Yeah, and I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that being a victim, particularly for some young men and some young women as well, is that it kind of evokes a sense of shame and a shame and a vulnerability. And I think that ultimately, if you're going to experience violence, I think that feeling like you're in control of it somehow helps overcome that sense of shame. And if you read any work around James Gilligan, a forensic analyst from the States, and his great book, Violence, the World's Deadliest Epidemic, he says that the kind of all violence is predicated on this idea of shame and humiliation. I mean, you could argue we're seeing it now, and I think ultimately one of the ways that men in particular overcome this sense of shame and humiliation is to invest in violence as a way to control it and enact it and rehearse it on their terms.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. So I think it could be said that there's a high rate of domestic violence among those who box. So when we're teaching people to box, are we just teaching them how to hurt each other more effectively?
I'd be reticent to say that boxing increases domestic violence, but what I will say is that I think we are compounding the fact that violence is a way to overcome an obstacle, whether that's an opponent in the ring or an unobliging partner in the house. I also think, like I said, that shame underpins a lot of violence enactment and rehearsal, and so does domestic violence, in my opinion. I think that we need to unpack that sense of shame that kind of, predicates domestic violence, as Naomi just suggested about men in prison as well. So I think if you feel disrespected, violence becomes a quick and easy resource to rely upon to kind of disavow shame quickly and restore respect to the self. And, if we look at attachment theory, or we look at kind of any work that's done kind of more in that psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytical field, we can see that really underplays a lot of domestic violence as well. And so I think it's a combination of attachment theory, shame, and violence as a resource. And I think boxing, overlaid amongst all that, actually just makes violence a bigger resource to be able to draw on with more kind of, I don't know, resources within it, really. It makes you stronger and fitter and more prepared to rely on it, I think.
Thank you.
Deborah, you might not be able to answer this. It's a bit unfair
I'll
landing
try.
with it because you haven't researched it. But I wondered whether intuitively, whether you felt there were any differences between boxing and the other sorts of martial arts that you've been very immersed in.
I've researched it a little bit for my PhD, and I was also interested because I'd studied martial arts previously. There's a great paper written in the 90s by an academic called Derek Kruger from the States, who actually did a study looking at martial arts and boxing and the difference in terms of, kind of violence, the kind of illegitimacy of violence. And they found that there wasn't much evidence for martial artists in the traditional sense of the word enacting illegitimate violence outside of the dojo or the ring. However, the same couldn't be said for boxing. Now, why that is, Kruger didn't really say. Off the top of my head, I would say it's got to do with class again, which is what makes boxing so interesting, is that the middle classes tend to flock to karate and kung fu and tai chi and the more traditional Chinese martial arts. There's kind of working class communities tend to flock more to the kind of traditional boxing, whether that's to do with finances or accessibility, or whether it goes back to what I said earlier about it's more accessible, it's more diverse boxing. I think also there's something to do with the fact that martial arts, although this was pre-mixed martial arts, because I think that's a whole category within itself, I think it's something to do with the kind of hierarchy. So I think the whole idea of having a sensei or a sifu within martial arts, the uniform, the kind of respect, the higher order, it's almost got a religiosity to it that I don't think boxing has. And I think the religiosity of martial arts and the tradition of it coming through the more kind of Chinese lineage lends itself to a more hierarchical disciplinary nature that somehow might actually prevent that idea of illegitimate violence that standalone boxing might not.
Just wondering about the visual symbolism in boxing actually as well, you know, the emphasis on sort of muscle and also all that swagger that happens before the fight actually happens. You know, it's all part of the, you know, that build up is all part of it, isn't it? Whereas I suppose martial arts, I don't know much about them, but it seems kind of like quieter, less showy in some ways. So I wonder if there's more of an
Agreed.
ability to display your masculinity if you engage in boxing than if you're, you know, a black belt in karate, for instance.
Well, in martial arts, you bow to each other before you fight. In boxing, you just disrespect and shame each other before you fight. I think that in of itself says a lot.
So you're now training as a forensic psychoanalyst, Deborah. What made you decide to take your studies in this direction? It's a bit of a contrast from
It is.
boxing.
It is because I guess one thing is I would always say I'm a criminologist. My PhD is in criminology, but when you try and define criminology, people call it a meeting place of law, sociology, psychology. So I feel like it lends itself to criminology in some respects, but I guess what made me decide to kind of take my studies in this direction was my PhD was very psychosocial. So it was all qualitative. I didn't do any quant studies or RCTs of boxing or boxing gyms. It was very much kind of N=1, where I'd interview individuals who were boxing and try and understand their personal motivations for going, you know, what their story was. I use life history interview techniques, which, as you know, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic therapy and writings very much do use that N=1 approach. I was supervised by Professor David Gadd at Manchester, who was working in a very psychoanalytical way at that time. He was using very Kleinian-based approaches to kind of thinking about violence, particularly domestic violence, which was his area. So I adopted some of this thinking and then started to kind of develop my thinking around violence in a much more forensic way, because I specialize in kind of youth violence. I started to kind of train the lens and think more forensically, psychoanalytically about the motivations for youth violence and gang violence. And that led to me training at the Portman Clinic in London, because I find it's just much better for understanding the kind of agentic nature of violence, kind of much more so than the kind of sociological poverty drives violence, which it arguably does. But I think individual motivations and personal reasons actually drive violence much, much more.
Thank you. And you've been working in the criminal justice system for quite a long time. How have you maintained your own well-being over this period?
Some might say I haven't, but I am in therapy myself as part of my training at the Portman Clinic. I have to be in twice weekly psychoanalysis. That helps you think through some of the violent stories you hear in forensic settings. I do a lot of my research is now based within secure children's homes, youth offending institutes, and there's a lot of trauma. Those institutions, as you're both aware, carry a lot of trauma in their walls and in the people that are kind of housed in them. And I think being able to think through some of that, either kind of in a supervisory way or in a personal way, the way these stories can impact you. You know, hearing hard stories of violence perpetration and violence victimization does seep in, doesn't it? You know, in the transference, and also in my counter transference, in the way that I research and the way that I write. So I find therapy very, very useful. I think having a good, strong project team, you know, like I said, I'm the co-director of the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies, and we all research similar areas. And I think having a team around you to just be able to say, it was tough, or, you know, what have you heard today? So I think it's about relationships, whether that's therapeutic ones or kind of collegiate friendships. Good teams, good colleagues really help you do this kind of work, I think.
Thank you very much, Deborah.
No worries.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much indeed, Deborah.
Yeah, I hope that answered everything.
Yeah, lovely, and you're very articulate.